4, 3.
Good day and welcome to this week's eNCA live debate. I'm your host, Trudy Makaya. I am an African, former President Thabo Mbeki declared, and South Africans applauded. But 12 years down the line, in 2008, South Africans found it difficult to coexist with African nationals in their communities. And in recent weeks, with another flare-up of xenophobic violence, we have heard South Africans declare yet again that they are African. It's an easy thing to say, but what do we mean when we say we are African? Do we say it just to be politically correct, or do we genuinely feel to be part of this beautiful continent? Today's debate will look at what it means to be African and what obligations it carries towards other Africans. Joining us today in studio, we have Justice Mokhedi, a member of I See a Different You collective from Soweto, and they strive to portray Africa as they see it. We also have Tracy Angus-Hammond, who is a researcher. She also describes herself as an explorer, and she'll tell us more about her travels in a moment. And as always, our social media editor, Aaron Bates, keeping a close eye on our very fabulous and outspoken online audience. So I'll begin with you, Justice.
Sure.
What makes you African?
It's a broad question, but personally what makes me African is the fact that I'm born here, the fact that I was born with the privilege of being able to inherit what our continent has to offer towards the world. And as I said, it's very broad, but being African to me also means humanity, being connected with the rest of our continent, being connected with the rest of our African brothers and sisters. And yeah, it's simply being African is the privilege of inheriting the rich history of our continent.
The rich history of our continent, amazing. And Tracy, for you, what does it mean?
I think that being African is my culture. It's the thing that I've learned to be. We learn how to behave in certain situations, how to dress, whether a wedding dress is red or white or not a dress at all, is all defined by our circumstances, and that is my culture. This is where I was born, this is what I know, and everything that I do is sort of through the lens of that is around me.
The lens of that's around you. And this is an interesting point because it is around us. We are in Africa, but so many times we talk as if Africans are different or that there is a different place that is almost othered. Justice, in your work trying to debunk common media stereotypes, is that an easy thing to do?
To be honest, it's not easy because most of the time, or some of the time, we are communicating to an audience that don't really travel. So I think the opportunity to travel, or the opportunity to travel personally, and me the opportunity to see myself more connected to the rest of the world or the rest of the continent, as in Africa. So when we communicate what we feel strongly about, which is Africa, it's hard to get it across as good as we'd love it to go across, because not every South African sees themselves as Africans, and not every African sees themselves as the rest of Africa, because of the history of what happened in our continent, colonialism, and that segregation created something very bad that's so entrenched in us, even in me, or then it was entrenched in me.
I want to get to that because is it just that we end up playing our history in South Africa, that perhaps South Africa, in terms of culture, in terms of even development, relative development, has been isolated. It's kind of taken its own path over the past, we can even say 300 years. And therefore, to expect an embeddedness with the rest of the continent after such a long period of isolation is perhaps unrealistic. Tracy?
I completely agree. I think that we haven't had the opportunity to build relationships with our neighbors. We, in the past, they were almost treated as territories to a certain extent. And how are we supposed to build relationships in that context? I think the other thing that's important is we're just completely unaware of our connections even with the rest of the continent. We were recently on an expedition in East Africa, and we went to go and do a food garden at the Chief Albert Lutuli Primary School, and we were quite surprised because it's the Chief Albert Lutuli Private School.
Yeah.
And when we looked up the address to find out exactly where we were going, it was on the Solomon Nhlanhla campus. And so there was all this history, and we arrived, and there was a big ANC flag with the peace stuff outside, and we sort of were a little astounded at this connection and spoke to them more, and they taught us about which liberation heroes had been there, who'd studied there, what the role of this country was. And maybe if we had a stronger connection with all of that, maybe this would start to change. But until we understand or even know what those connections are, historically, but culturally as well, the language similarities, all of that sort of thing. I mean, it's amazing how quickly you can pick up Swahili if you know a little bit of Xhosa. So all of that sort of stuff, we just need the opportunity to be exposed to it.
So we're not exposed to our own backyard in a certain sense. What is our audience saying, Erin?
We've got some response on the element of travel, which is something that Justice spoke about. I asked Rian Mansa, who's travelled widely on the continent, which places kind of touched a nerve with him or struck a chord. And he said there's so many places across the continent. Liptus Magna ruins 90 kilometers east of Tripoli in Libya, one of Africa's most beautiful capitals, Freetown, Sierra Leone. And another respondent on Twitter, Stefan Lombard, says that Tunis is such a strange but beautiful mix of Africa, the Middle East and the Mediterranean. So, touching on that element of travel. And then our own journalist, Yusuf Omar, said, and I think this is quite true often, South Africa acts like it's having a great party and the rest of Africa is just in the quiet apartment upstairs.
Oh goodness, that's quite an apt way of putting it. But so, I think that just says it all. There is this other that we need not understand, and not much has been done to make sure that we understand that. Just moving away from the media, but and maybe our education and just our general understanding. Do you think we consume enough African, using the word broadly, literature, art, music?
Personally, I don't think we do. I say that because I came from a Bantu education. I went to schools in the township. I grew up in Soweto. I only had an opportunity to go to Model C schools later, maybe when I was in grade 10, but it was an okay school. And the education I was getting throughout my childhood to when I was done with school didn't give me the opportunity to learn more about African history, know more about South African history, the different versions of South African history, because the only story that was focused on was the only one that's still being focused on, about Jan van Riebeeck. And so personally I don't think that's enough history for us. I gained more interest in African history as I grew up, and I realized that there were a lot of nicer stories, amazing heroes, amazing leaders, Sankara, Lumumba, Robert Sibukwe. I never learnt about him when I was in school. And I think there's a gap.
There is a gap, and in a way, I suppose what we know is almost the stereotypes that would be, a little bit in the books you learn about conflict perhaps, but not necessarily why there's conflict, how countries got there, and what it all means. Now, Tracy, in your travels, what do you wish South Africans knew about the rest of Africa or understood about the rest of Africa?
I think to a certain extent, we bought into the 80s myth of the basket case that is Africa, but we've never moved on. And even the rest of the world has moved on, and I think we haven't got past that. And, people say to us, you're never going to be able to cross the continent without being asked for bribes at every single point. And we got through 10 countries and 192 roadblocks, border crossings, the works, before a single bribe request. That was in the DRC.
Amazing,
We hit the DRC and it was a different story. But of those countries, that was the only one that fitted the stereotype. We came across people creating innovation from nothing. We came across people who just knew no limits, wanted to achieve something and could do it and were. And sort of almost just a lack of a lack of acknowledgement of the barriers that exist and that are going And so they're exceeding everywhere. And if we could just stop for a minute, stop thinking we're the gateway to Africa. We're not. We're at the end of the continent.
Yes, that's amazing. We tell ourselves that
all the time, and we're not. And if we could learn a little, we could learn from Rwanda in terms of reconciliation. Some of their solutions are absolutely mind-blowing, incredibly successful. We could learn from Zimbabwe and Ghana in terms of education, because despite Zimbabwe, look at their literacy rates still. We could learn from the East African community in terms of the way they're cooperating, and when they're failing, what went wrong and how we could learn from that. But we do have to open our eyes and acknowledge that there's something to offer, and that's our first step.
Do you struggle, Justice, when you talk to your peers, let me put it that way, who might not share the same interest in the rest of the continent? Do you struggle to convince them to develop an interest?
Not so much, because honestly, I think with my brothers, we look a specific way that's kind of almost interesting. So when we speak to people about what we do and our interests and how interesting a certain place is, we are very fortunate that people find an interest in that and they kind of believe it. And when they follow our work shows the beauty in most of the things we are doing and the beauty in most of the places we are going. And that already sparks an interest. So we don't struggle much. You know, I think in terms of converting people to be interested, we do. Maybe in terms of getting them to follow through, it's a different story, because maybe there are finances and other things that challenge.
That are barriers. That's interesting. Yeah, because I think you do create compelling images that I think open people's minds in many ways. But, you know, what does it mean? What's the next step, beyond admiring the work and trying to be more engaged in it? Aaron, do we find that our audience is engaged with the
We've
continent?
had some sort of responses. I'm not getting a lot of traffic through at the moment, but I am relying on a colleague to kind of filter that through for me, so maybe there's a delay there. But I did receive on Thabo Mbeki's comments about Africa and a kind of African renaissance. I mean, that's such a kind of iconic moment in South African sort of discussions about the continent and our identity in relation to it. A follower on Twitter mentioning that and saying, that's the South Africa that's the Africa that I identify with. And then another one, I got someone called Makusuda, who says nothing but shares an image, in fact, an image of Walter Sisulu and Nelson Mandela, and then includes a memory or a kind of tribute to Walter Sisulu from Mandela, which translates as saying, has your name been enrolled in the struggle for freedom? Permit us to register you in the struggle for freedom. I shall miss his friendship and counsel. I don't know quite the connection between that and the discussion on Africa, but maybe
I suppose maybe a different generation of South African leaders were more connected to the continent.
Maybe, and through the kind of exile travels and struggles that you spoke about. I remember, when I worked in radio, we often got calls. There was one lady in particular, I don't remember her name, but she was the child of exile, a political sort of people who'd fled, political exiles. And she spoke so sort of compellingly about being schooled in Botswana and traveling through southern Africa with her parents and what an impact it had made on her upbringing. And it's absolutely what you're talking about, where there are these schools, these institutions, these kind of hallmarks of South African history, but they're in our neighboring countries and we at home don't even know about them.
But I suppose, the stereotypes goes both ways. When you travel as a South African, do you often hit against perceptions around South Africans?
I think generally once they find that you're South African, you travel, then they immediately go away. Because the first thing is, South African travels. Travelers traveler. South Africans travel.
Yeah.
But once you get past that, then it's just an interest of, okay, so but where, what, how? And I think that's generally the attitude maybe that we're lacking a little in South Africa is, it's, okay, so then why? You know, when we crossed the Congo, we went on a commercial barge with 800 other people in not necessarily fantastic circumstances, and everybody kept saying, but why do you want to do this? It's because we want to see this side of Africa. We want
so they're not used to seeing South Africans being out there and interested.
No.
Yeah.
Look, that also
other than as business people, perhaps.
As business people, yes. And then we come in wanting to impose South African business ways. And often South African businesses don't do as well as they could because they're not listening to expertise on the ground. And we make an assumption, particularly business South Africans, that we know better and we can do better. And that's not, we're often incredibly arrogant, and maybe some people might take offense to that. But I think as South Africans, we're too arrogant towards the rest of the continent. And that does stem from our leadership as well. You know, it wasn't that long ago we had Zuma making disparaging remarks about the roads in Malawi.
Yeah.
We were actually there at the time driving. I drove most of them myself. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But then on the other side of the political spectrum, we've got Helen Zille making comments about foreigners' involvements in the drug trade. So across our political spectrum, we have no decent example to start changing this. And so yes, there is the education system, there's a lack of travel, there's a lack of not knowing our history, but it does need to start at a bigger, better level than that, and that starts at the top.
And just as, do you get any pushback when you engage with or even travel in the rest of Africa?
Yeah, a little bit. Well, simply because when we meet people, people are surprised that we are South Africans. And it's disheartening, you know, because their idea of who we are is not exactly what it is, you know. So people assume, and they've got this image of what we should be or where we live is.
What kind of image is that?
Well, to be honest, it's like they think we are living in the bush. You know, we are living in an extreme rural situation, and we are not tech savvy. We are not.
So this would be outside Africa, about the continent.
Yes, this is outside Africa, and you know, it's surprising that they think that, and when they meet us, they feel like they're meeting an international citizen. And I don't think it's just us that are special. There are international citizens. That, you know, the majority of our country is, you know, we are tech savvy. You know, we are a country that's moving forward, and it is disheartening to see and engage with people that think that we are otherwise.
I want to respond on that because I was watching, please forgive me, the Kardashian reruns yesterday. But it was an episode where Khloe Kardashian, Trudy's just like wincing, I could see it.
I am not.
But Khloe Kardashian was about to join French Montana, coming to South Africa for the MTV Music Awards, okay? And he was going to present, she was going to join them, they were going to Africa. And it was so weird watching Khloe like she's my best friend, but Khloe described going to Africa, because I think a lot of that attitude is internalized by South Africans, and I think some of it's cultural, and I think some of it's historical, and some of it's also just aspirational. You know, if you adopt an American attitude towards your own continent, is that somehow putting you above Africa? Because we have this kind of weird inferiority complex. But they spoke about Africa and it being another world, and then they touched down in Durban, and the first thing French Montana said in his like jet-lagged state was that he wanted to see a monkey running across the road. And it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you said that. But you know, how much of that is something that we have also internalized, maybe not about our own country, but about our neighbors and about places up continent, Lagos, very dynamic city, full of trade, full of business, full of tech. And yet, you know, is a South African sitting in a taxi coming out of the Lagos airport going, I can't wait to see a monkey run across the road. I think that's something we need to interrogate.
Do you think that perhaps to a certain extent business people sort of perpetuate that myth? Because you need me as the middleman to help you negotiate this very dark continent.
Oh, you know, the statement, you know, it's often said, oh, we like going to the rest of Africa. We're going to start from scratch, you know, we're going to introduce, there is that
and how patronizing is that attitude?
Absolutely.
It's terrible.
Yeah. And when you interact with other South Africans and you tell them about your travels and your work in the rest of the continent, how do they react who are not as exposed?
I think just surprised, constantly surprised at the fact that we were safe living on the side of the road in tents, you know, etc., that we weren't constantly asked for money, that we did cross the DRC without paying a bribe. It probably cost us a week and we had guns in our faces a couple of times, but it is possible. It takes two people to be corrupt. It's not just a corrupt policeman who accepts your bribe. And I think that that's something that we as South Africans also need to start playing a role in. We like to go to Nigeria and it's just too easy to, you know, it's this corrupt continent, this corrupt country, and we dole out the money, and are you not now making the cycle carry on? You know, and it is possible to do business across the continent, it's possible to travel across the continent without participating in the downfall of something that is going to eat us.
I think that's an amazing point you raised, that you can interact with the continent just as you would anywhere else, and that sometimes our stereotypes, then they become self-fulfilling prophecies in many ways. We're going to take a bit of a breather, a 2-minute break, and then we'll be back. We'll keep chatting online, and we'll take this conversation forward and try to understand what does it mean to be an African and what obligations and duties does it carry.
Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, in Malawi, in Zambia, in Swaziland, in Lesotho, wherever you want. We actually are a big family.
Do ordinary South Africans engage enough with the continent through literature, travel, music, and business?
I write to be read, to be acknowledged. In other words, it means what I've written has made some impact somewhere.
In this week's eNCA Live, we probe what it means to be African and what obligation it carries towards other Africans.
I think as South Africans, we're all here to say xenophobia is not done in our names and to stand in solidarity with our African brothers and sisters.
And we're back. Now, with our online debate, often we find that we find it challenging sometimes when we try to, present a particular view and we don't seem to move on from a certain part of the debate. But I think let's go back a little bit to those stereotypes that we're talking about, because I think that's still what we're getting from online, isn't it?
We are, and I think the problem with Twitter is that it's kind of like the peanut gallery, and sometimes the dregs of society sort of rumble and bubble up. So let's have a look at some of the responses. We've got Peter de Villiers who says, quite disappointingly, stereotypes exist for a reason. Africa is rife with crime and corruption. Africans seem to accept this as everyday life because all Africans obviously, have one take on corruption. Thanks, Peter. And then we have another one. The handle is @jcos01 and the photograph is a painting of Jan van Riebeck, just as a little bit of context. And the remark is, being African means failure, chaos, no direction, beggars. What's your response to that, Tracy?
I need to try to be polite about it, I guess, but I think it comes from a pure lack of knowledge. If you look at any of the GDP growth rates, if you look at the increases in literacy, the number of Millennium Development Goals that the countries across the continent have been reaching, everything from access to water, electricity, ARVs, mortality rates, or everything, you just evidently don't know what you're talking about, because the rest of the continent is exploding. If you look at the 54 countries, there's maybe 10 at the moment where there's conflict or leftover from Ebola, etc. 10 out of 54. I'd guarantee there's more instability in Europe at the moment. And so maybe it's time that we broaden what we read a little.
But isn't that also part of the problem? I mean, you want to talk about social media and kind of perceptions of the continent. Ebola, suddenly, you know, you have this kind of proliferation of kind of panic and people regurgitating stereotypes. And then the good news, the GDPs, the numbers, the facts that are all there are just they're not repeated. The dregs of society want to kind of stick to the stereotype of what our continent is.
And I suppose it's something that's a bit distressing about the online world. And I want to tap your brain on this, in that, do you find that people who come and admire your work are people who already think like you? Or do you ever meet someone who you've changed from where they started interacting your work and afterwards?
It's a bit of both. And when we started, we encountered a lot of people that never saw things the way we see them. You know, they've never engaged with Africa the way we show it. And it was quite refreshing. We still encounter those kind of experiences, and a lot of them come up and they talk to us about how they feel. And over the years, we've made friends that are international and some African that are lifetime friends from just the project we've been doing, and they are excited about how we've changed their perceptions. And some of them visit us, some of them we visit, you know, and it's a mixed bag of both. But to be honest with, it's nicer with the guys that had no idea, you know, and when we engage with them, it's mind blowing. You know, and
it's interesting because in a way you've overcome a certain kind of temptation, I think, in media and in creative industries, where perhaps in talking to an international audience or a South African audience that's a bit close-minded, what would sell would probably be what they're used to. So when you come with different images, is it a good business idea to come up with an alternative view?
Yeah, well, it has proven to become a good idea, because we got good enough exposure to become a business in what we are doing, and it's working well. We are growing, and we find ourselves, you know, tapping into industries that we've never thought we'd tap into.
Just break it down. What do you do exactly? How do you?
So I see a different you as a baby of 99. So 99 is our umbrella company that takes care of us. So we are photographers, fashion photography, and photography as a whole, and we do, you know, content, and we engage with brands to align them to a target audience. And we are all-round creative, so we come up with creative solutions, you know, that are non-traditional advertising, and to engage with people in a non-traditional way. Hence, the project we do engages with people in a fresh way. It just happens to be driven photographically.
Okay.
Trudy, if I can return to the Kardashians just briefly.
Absolutely.
I think in terms of creative industries, design, advertising, photography, even like sports brands, like some sports shoe brands have partnered so well with South African young designers. And to me, I think, you know, in terms of business and kind of perceptions of the continent, maybe that's a little pocket of hope and a pocket of kind of innovation, is where you have Adidas partnering with brilliant South African photographers and doing great partnerships that really reflect an urban, young Africa that's so different from the stereotype.
Yeah, well, from my point of view and experience, I think the whole world is looking to Africa for fresh African content that's world class. So if you are out there and you've got something really fresh and it's world class, you'll crack it. Brands will come to you, and you know.
It's not like in a different generation where perhaps to crack it or to even have a career as a creative, it was about conflict, being good with conflict photography, being, you know, in tune with issues around poverty. You're actually quite the other end. You're looking at, you know, brands and fashion and, you know, aspirational ideas. Yeah,
well, that was very important to us because we are living in the current generation. You know, we're not living in the generation of Steve Biko and the uprising, because the photographers then were relevant for capturing that and being there at the right time for that. So our generation is a generation that's, you know, we are at the crux of our country moving forward. You know, we have amazing things happening, and if you are right in the middle of that and you capture that well in a fresh way, I think you will have a voice, and that's what we identified ourselves as, you know, creatives with a voice that's speaking current.
Now, Tracy, obviously when we say we belong to one African community, it must come with some obligation. Do you think that there is a sense of an obligation in terms of, for instance, aid, where countries are in crisis, deepening trade on fair terms with the rest of the continent, having a reasonably flexible immigration policy that's accommodating? Do you think we understand those kinds of obligations?
I don't think we do. I don't think we have them, which is quite surprising considering our history. But I think we need to think of this as a bigger community. You act like you would in a community. Sometimes when that means someone's in crisis, you help out. Sometimes when that means we need to do something together, we work together. And we need to look at it, sometimes you can teach me something that I didn't know. And we need to look at it as very much a sort of give and take relationship. We enter into a relationship together. And if we can start sort of getting that right, I think that changes things. I think that in terms of aid particularly, that's a bit of a bugbear of mine. I am trade, not aid. We send out 5 times more money in resources that we've given away for tiny amounts of aid. This continent that supposedly relies on the rest of the world, absolute nonsense. We are supporting all sorts of first world economies with the resources that are taken from us for virtually nothing in exchange for building a small little clinic in the corner of a rural area. And that's a perception that absolutely needs to change. Aid does not help us at all. And if you're going to do a little bit of research, you don't even have to go far. Google trade and aid infographic. You'll find a fantastic infographic that shows you just how much money we get given, and how much we give to get that tiny amount. And so let's take aid off the table completely. Of course, there are certain circumstances. Nepal at the moment is a completely different story. And if something like that was going on, I'm absolutely there for supporting my neighbors. But aid is just a general process, does not work. We don't need it.
Also, isn't that sometimes an excuse to just do business anyway? I mean, I know just anecdotally I've met people who come from the Netherlands and they've come here to work for a freighting company that sends aid up continent. And it's not about goodwill or giving a preferential rate because you know that there's a duty there to do it because people are desperate. It's how much can you leverage in terms of profit and cut your costs and whatever.
We were living in Nairobi for a while and we met someone who worked for an aid organization. I won't mention the name, but they were there to help with food security. And we said, but in the community that we live, there's a perfect solution. It's working incredibly well. Why don't you come and see it? Maybe you can roll it out in the rest of the country. And she said, but that might just solve the problem. Hang on, what now? Said, but if I need to very carefully manage my results because you want to have a little bit of success because otherwise people won't keep giving you money. But if you solve the problem too much, then my budget will get smaller next year.
Where's your aid industry?
It's an industry. Yeah. It is nothing more than an industry.
Okay. So we agree, as South Africa, we're not going to add to that problem. But in terms of fair trade or even, I suppose, open borders, Justice, do you think do you think we should be doing more? We do enough?
I think we should be doing more. I think our country is ready to engage with more industries or more brands or in terms of business and all around in all industries because I think structurally we are solid. We've been tried and tested over the years and we should definitely engage.
But what about this idea that South Africa already has so many challenges that we can't be open as we would like?
That's based on assuming the rest of Africa brings nothing but problems. And I think that's the first thing we need to put away. So, we've got so many things to deal with already. How can we possibly deal with? Maybe that's the solution.
Yeah, and
but isn't the difficulty that it's one thing to have that conversation here, it's another thing to have that amongst a community of mine workers who are South African, who see people coming in from Zimbabwe getting paid much less and threatening their jobs or perceived to be threatening their jobs. How do we negotiate this on a grassroots level where there is a lot of xenophobia and a lot of hostility towards other African
perhaps if the system was formalized a little better and there was a contribution as well as a take. So if you speak to people, I was having a conversation with someone the other day who was trying to explain to me why she feels quite so xenophobic, and she was saying, but there's this person who lives next door to me, is from country X, and she's got a South African passport and a passport from her home country. So now she's getting social grants. That's what makes me angry. That's what makes me this. That's what makes me that. And if she paid tax, I'd feel better. If she did this, I'd feel better. So if you formalize the system and you are going to give out sort of rewards, that comes with responsibilities as well. And maybe if the entire system became a little bit more formalized and more transparent, so that we could say, these are the numbers. This is how many Zimbabweans work in South Africa. This is how much tax they're paying. This is how much this is how much that. Maybe the first step is just laying it all out there and formalizing the system.
Because we can't just keep going and not wanting to engage properly.
No.
Because the research is a bit localized, and there's debate around the stats around migration. So I think that certainly would be a good place to start, just to make the conversation
I'm
open.
afraid we're not going to break off and be our own island anytime soon.
No.
So
we need to come to terms with, what is our wealth in some ways and our heritage. Now, back to heritage. Do you think justice, in the way we see ourselves as South Africans, might inform some of the negative ways that we see the rest of Africa? I mean, I look at you, your hairstyle, your look, etc. For a long time, most South Africans would be, straightening their hair, that sort of thing. Do you think when we see other Africans and we look at their hues and their shapes and we listen to their tongues, do we appreciate that, or does it perhaps take us back to a place of, our own relationship with those things in our own cultures?
Well, simply, I think, I'll speak personally first. I think the way I see myself as a South African is a bit different to maybe how others do, because, like I said, I've been afforded the opportunity to see beyond what most see, like travel a little bit, and that afforded me to see myself differently and to see myself a lot more connected to the rest of the continent, in terms of, if I see a Nigerian brother, I won't see him way different to what I look like. I see them and I admire other things from them, and I pick up other things from them. I pick up other things from Rwandans. I pick up few things from different cultures I engage with, right? But before, so I'll speak before I was afforded the opportunity to see, when I saw other people, I saw myself different to them. I saw a huge difference. So I saw something foreign to what's normal to myself, and I think as South Africans, we grow up, or we are born into a system that isolates us from the rest of our continent, and this system is so entrenched in us. Wherever you go, I used to think that if I say I'm South African, it means that, okay, cool, I'm a better African. And I'm not a better African, I'm an African. We are African first before you are South African, right? So I think, from my experience, I think it's driven from not knowing. And when I emphasize on travel, I don't think travel means that you have to go to Mozambique or whatever. Travel is as effective when it's even here, from here to Lesotho, from here to KZN, and engage with different groups of people that are different to how you see things, and that kind of opens up.
It's almost like we don't appreciate African aesthetics. I mean, now with the xenophobia, a lot of it has also been around South Africans who are mistaken to be foreign because, with no real investigation about their heritage, just because of the way they look, whether they're dark-skinned or they appear more African. Why do we have this thing against African features,
I think,
African aesthetics?
From my experience of my own life, I think it comes from a deep-rooted tribalism thing. I grew up in the township as a vendor boy. I'm a vendor boy, and being a vendor boy in a community of black people, I was the least. It's like the last in the food chain. I'm the worst person. I grew up, I was supposed to be ashamed of who I am, because a Zulu is more superior than Venda and Sotho, and there's a whole tribalism thing. And generally Venda people are dark, big nose, all, there's a stereotype, right? And that stereotype is what created all of the mess that we have to deal with now, you know.
I mean, Tracy, do you think perhaps it's first about even sorting out our own divisions before we can appreciate
Absolutely.
what the continent has to offer?
Yeah, I think it is important that of the 7 deaths from the xenophobic violence in the last few weeks, 3 of those were South Africans. I think that indicates there's definitely a problem with our relationship with our neighbours. Further, let me be very clear, but I think we have much deeper rooted issues. And I often wonder, would anyone care how many Nigerians were employed in South Africa if all South Africans were? And I think that to a certain extent, a lot of this comes down to resources, your perception of social justice, not necessarily your reality. Your perception is your reality. You know nothing.
Yeah.
So if your perception is that your illegal immigrant neighbor is getting money from the government and you're not, then this sort of thing is going to happen. So, yeah.
Aaron, are we winning on?
We're
are we
getting
any
somewhere.
positive
It's been a bit slow today.
expressions?
Not much in terms of kind of, heartening, pan-African sort of fervor or anything like that. But I have an anecdote which is not on Twitter, but I think is quite important to share, and that's news. I haven't had confirmation, but apparently Ngugi wa Thiong'o is going to go to UCT and meet with the students there to talk to them about developing a Pan-African curriculum and how to transform the university. And he's doing it out of his own volition, from what I hear, and it's hearsay at this point, I should say that. But it does speak to a kind of sense of that's an African country. It's somehow related to what we've done at our university and what we're thinking in terms of kind of African art, African identity, and that sort of thing. Not on Twitter, but,
no, but I think it's
worth
very
a mention.
important that people are seeing our problems and saying, well, let's go and try and help and address them. Now we're running out of time, but finally, a borderless Africa, is that something you believe in, aspire to, or you think
Definitely.
it's unreasonable, and why?
Well, if Africa becomes borderless, that will create more opportunities for other people to engage with other opportunities. I was recently in Nigeria. I think as a country, as South Africa, we have a lot to learn from them as a country. Their entrepreneurial spirit, it's mind-blowing. And my perception of it was created from general perceptions. I wasn't sure what I was gonna see there. When I got to Ikeja, I was blown away. It's a gigantic city that's moving, and I think if we become borderless, there will be more opportunities for Africans and South Africans to learn from each other.
Thanks. We have to leave it there. Tracy?
I think that physical borders are the least of our problems, and we've got a long, long way to go as an entire sort of continental community that works together, and a lot of more barriers to get to before taking those borders up or down will actually make any difference. So yes, the end goal, absolutely, but I think there's a lot of perceptions starting here that need to change first.
Okay, so change perception first, but it seems that the aspiration is towards a united Africa that learns and nurtures each other.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much to our guests. You can catch this session on YouTube or on eNCA.com. And of course, join us again next week, Tuesday at 1:30 for our eNCA live debate on eNCA.com. Let's keep the conversation going on Twitter and on Facebook, and see you next week.